Howdy, and welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. The Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Let's get to it. Howdy, welcome back to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. Just a quick reminder about what we're doing here. I'm an amateur, not an expert. We're here to find inspiration, motivation, to discover deep and profound truth, and to learn lessons from dead poets who have gone on ahead of us, who have lived lives that we can learn from. And today, we're going to be learning from a female poet. So far, we have not examined the works of any female poets, but it's about time we break that barrier today. So we're going to be looking at a poem by Emily Dickinson today called Crumbling is Not an Instance Act. Crumbling is not an instance act, a fundamental pause. Dilapidation's processes are organized decays. 'Tis first a cobweb on the soul, a cuticle of dust, a borer in the axis, an elemental rust. Ruin is formal, devil's work, consecutive and slow. Fail in an instant, no man did. Slipping is Crashe's law. Now, I could spend a ton of time trying to talk about Emily Dickinson and all of that. Emily Dickinson was a very interesting person, a very unique person. She definitely marched to the beat of her own drum, and she was a prolific poet, publishing a lot of poetry. Some of it is considered to be in public domain. Others of it has basically just been published by Harvard University, and so they basically just kind of pimp Emily Dickinson out, which is really kind of distressing. I'm not sure what she would have thought about that, but regardless, this is one of the poems that Harvard says belongs to them, so you're not going to find me citing the entire thing anywhere. I don't want to get in any copyright trouble, but let's just take it to say I'm not sure that Emily Dickinson would really appreciate Harvard, the institution, bogarting her poetry. Anyway, not the point here. Let's jump into this poem and let's see what we can learn from Emily Dickinson today. So the very first stanza that she gives us, she says that crumbling is not an instance act, a fundamental pause. Dilapidation's processes are organized decays. Now, she seems to be talking about this crumbling, and she reminds us that nothing crumbles in a moment, in an instant. You don't have something go from being intact, well-built, well put together, to crumbling all of a sudden. Okay. She says, it's not an instance act. It's not a fundamental pause. Dilapidation's processes are organized decays. Now, when I think of dilapidation, I imagine like an old, rotting house. Okay, and there is no single cause and effect event that would make that house go from being a viable structure you could live in to being a wreck on the side of the road. And so there was this house, it was this sort of old wooden house that I would have to drive past when I would go to high school. And I remember it was kind of this weird little house out in the middle of nowhere. There are these little backcountry roads, sort of in between developed areas where I grew up. And in order to go to my high school, I'd have to drive past this little shack. And this shack, it seemed like it'd been around forever. Nobody lived there. I have no idea who owned the property. I doubt they cared enough about that to do anything with it, and so it just stood there. And over time, it would become more and more and more dilapidated. Okay, so even if you haven't seen the shack that I grew up looking at, the Saxy Shack, that's what we called it. Even if you've never seen that one, you probably have seen something like this. If you've driven through any of the country highways that are not like major interstates, sort of 2-lane little highways or little roads that kind of wind and curve around farm to market roads or something like that, you probably noticed some old abandoned structure somewhere, and you've seen this structure be in some state of disrepair, right? And so, without someone to maintain the building, to put a new coat of paint on it, to fix the window panes that start to break or fall out, to put shingles and tiles back on the roof, if you don't have that, the building falls into a further and further state of disrepair. Now, in this poem, she says that dilapidation's processes are organized decays. And this sort of drags me away from this house that I'm thinking of. The shack on the side of the road that's fallen apart. Because there's nothing organized about that. Is there? Is there? I mean, saying that dilapidation's processes are organized decays, it almost seems to imply intelligence. There's some sort of organizing intelligence or principle. Could it be human reason? Could it just be human creation? Perhaps merely the act of creating something makes this decay inevitable and organizes it. Decay happens after you build something. Maybe that's what she's getting at. Maybe that without human creation, there would be no crumbling structure. Like, would the house crumble if no one had been there to build it? Of course not. So I think, when we ask the question, what ultimately does cause the crumbling? Well, it's the inevitable result of time, isn't it? Like, nothing lasts forever. We talked about Ozymandias last time, the statue that may have stood for hundreds of years, but eventually comes crumbling down. And everything that we build will come down eventually. But some things may actually slow that process down or speed it up. You see, our choices, our processes, those have a bit of a say in it. Think back to Longfellow's poem, The Builders. Right? If we build this tower of our destiny, tower of our fate, well, maybe it'll actually stand the test of time. But if we build it poorly, it will certainly crumble much faster. So, I'm starting to suspect, after reading the very first line here, the first stanza, that Emily Dickinson is not just talking about the inevitable decay of a structure, of an object, of an edifice that we build. I'm starting to suspect that she is about to apply the crumbling to people, to us. Okay? We're getting closer and closer to that idea. And in the second stanza, the suspicion is confirmed. You see, in this first stanza, she offers us a warning that you could pretty much think of as, maybe these are building practices. Things don't fall down all at once. So maybe this is a warning that we should build things wisely. But now we're moving away from merely the ravage of time, of just time that goes on, to the decay of the soul. You see, she's very specific in the words that she chooses. There are not a lot of words in this poem, and the economy of the second stanza is pretty impressive and beautiful if you think about it. 'Tis first a cobweb on the soul, a cuticle of dust, a borer in the axis, an elemental rust. So now we have cobwebs, we have dust, and we have borers, and we have rust, and those are still pictures of a building, right? You would have cobwebs in a building, dust on a building, rust on the metal of a building, borers, holes in different, beams and supports. But the word soul is starting to take us into a metaphor where one thing is something else. Where this crumbling is not just a shack on the side of the road, but this crumbling is becoming us. To say that there's a cobweb on the soul implies that this is not merely the decay of an edifice or a structure, and it's not even the sort of ravage of time as you get older and start to, your body starts to fall apart. You're not as, flexible as you used to. Maybe not, you don't recover as quickly. This isn't even just talking about old age, because she uses the word soul. It's a really important idea. The soul of the person is the very thing crumbling, and therefore this human being themselves is starting to collapse. And I don't think we're just supposed to think of this as death or old age. Because if you think about it, how does a soul decay? I mean, after all, a soul is not constructed. Or is it? The concept of a soul is a Platonic idea, going back to ancient Greek philosophers. Sort of the idea that matter and physical things are sort of base and not worthwhile, and we should instead attempt to transcend them and worry far more about the state of our soul. This is an ancient Greek philosophy idea that a lot of other religions have sort of adopted this. Like, you'll hear this in Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Like, you'll hear in even some of the Eastern religions. But for the most part, these religions that have come into greater contact with Greek philosophy, like the ones I just mentioned, the idea of a soul sort of gets absorbed in. And so the soul is the part of you that survives post-death. And so you care more about the soul because the soul is immortal, the body is not. The soul is good and right, the body is base and wicked. And so when she talks about cobwebs on the soul, well, this is a pretty big deal. And so this is not just the person's flesh, but their soul decaying. So if a soul can decay, does that mean that it was constructed? If it was constructed, how? How do you build a soul? Well, it depends on what you think of by soul. Some religions will say that your soul, your essence, just kind of gets transported into your body, and you maybe don't remember any of your past lives, but every time you live, you sort of go around the wheel again, and you're reincarnated, born with a new body, and you have another chance to improve your soul, but you don't necessarily know what your soul was like in other places. And maybe this is a sort of you got the sort of high Middle Ages Catholic idea of purgatory, right, where your soul has to be sort of purified and cleansed before it's fit to go to heaven. So but where does a soul come from? Are we born with them? Are they created somewhere else and then transported into our bodies? Well, it depends on what you think. Plato would say that you are born with a body and a soul, that as you become an existent being, you have a soul. So your soul is born, your soul grows, but your soul can also decay. And even if you take a more sort of the before the really Hellenization of Christian theology, the soul was thought of more as your spirit, your personality, sort of the animating factor behind your person. But can your personality decay? Can your soul decay? I don't know. But I think that when we read Emily Dickinson, we need to understand how she would have looked at soul. And I think she would have looked at it in that sort of Platonic way. That your soul is separate from your body. That your soul is eternal. Your body is not. And so if your soul begins to crumble, you're in serious danger. Serious danger. Not just are you going to become a worse person, but now you start to end up under the threat of maybe hell, purgatory, something like that, where, things may not go so well for you if your soul begins to crumble. And so when I read this poem, I'm not exactly sure how to look at it, but when we talk about the crumbling of the soul, I think it's easy to look at the way that things crumble. Okay? Systems crumble, societies crumble, governments crumble, human reason crumbles. Like we can reason ourselves into a paper bag that we can't get out of. Logic fails us at times. And even, constitutions, documents, religions, they all sort of crumble. But I think the way we need to interpret this poem is we need to look at this as our soul being our character, about being who we really are. The essence of ourselves is our soul. And so when Emily Dickinson says that crumbling is not an instant act, she's talking about preserving the integrity of your soul, meaning preserving the integrity of your character, of what makes you you. And I think if you understand Emily Dickinson, you would understand that her life is about being true to herself, not about being true to what society would say or what other people would say, but she would have valued her well thought out, intelligent conclusions that she'd come to about the way that the world is, and she would not have abandoned herself for anybody else. Emily Dickinson did not care a whole lot about conforming to pressure. Okay? If you read some of the stories about her life and her letters, she almost looks like this sort of rebellious atheist at a women's seminary who's like, no, y'all haven't convinced me that God is real. Like, she had this sort of, I'm going to march to the beat of my own drum. And I think that for Emily Dickinson to say that crumbling is not an instant act, we need to think about her being a unique person. A person full of conviction about the way that things are, and a person who, if she goes against her convictions, she betrays herself. So I think that's the way we look at this poem. I think that we have to look at what causes us as people to crumble. What causes us to lose our integrity, okay, as human beings, as the people that we really are. And I think it really gets driven home in the very last stanza. She says that ruin is formal. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean ruin has etiquette that it follows? Like a procedure? Like somebody wrote up a book about how the human soul is going to crumble? I doubt it. But, this is not that kind of etiquette. Bow ties, which fork to use first, all of that kind of stuff. That's probably not what we're talking about. Instead, ruin being formal would mean that it's proper, recognized, sanctioned, legitimate, formal, formalized. Okay? And so it seems like what she's saying is that such is the way of the world. Ruin is formal. Everything collapses, just like buildings, just like structures that we build, but so do human beings. So do human beings. We are also going to crumble, just like the laws of nature govern the world in such a way that nothing can last forever, that order starts to always devolve into chaos, that it's the same for us. We're not exempt. She says, the devil's work is consecutive and slow. Right? So, Christian mythology, the devil is the enemy of God's people. The devil is the one who tries to tempt Jesus to sin. The devil is the one who's, the ruler of the world and the sort of the ruler of the spiritual powers of the world that make war on God. You read Revelation, Satan is the one sort of leading this army to battle the forces of good at the end. He's the enemy of people, of human beings. He's associated with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And if you don't know that story, Satan, or the serpent, was the one who tempted humans to sin, who reintroduces chaos into the world. And their sin causes the people to go from vibrant, eternal life into death. And so ruin being formal is a result of the devil's work. But it's also consecutive and slow. So I'm a teacher. I have taught many different things, including history and science. Those are probably two of the things I've spent most of my time teaching. But whenever I teach history, I always try to make sure my students look at history as a series of causes and effects. One thing happens that leads another thing to happen, that leads another thing to happen, because if you understand how they link together, you have a much better picture of the entire story of history, and sort of a bigger idea, a general idea, as opposed to a bunch of facts. But knowing how those facts fit together is important. So history happens really fast in books, but it happens really slowly in reality. And while on paper it may look like the Roman Republic crumbled to dust in an instant, it really didn't. It wasn't a couple of chapters and Rome goes from vibrant republic to brutal empire. That's not how it happens. It happens over time. Right? So history may happen fast in books but slow in reality, and many different things link together to lead us from one thing to the next. Okay? It's the same with decay. The decay of our souls may look to be inevitable and organized, and we may have even Satan himself set against us, the devil, out to cause us to crumble. But it's consecutive, and it's slow. And if you do the work, maybe you can prevent that failing. Let me tell you what I mean. She says, fail in an instant, no man did, right? So just like the dilapidation of a building, the cobwebs on the soul, They'll catch up to us in really big public ways, but it doesn't all happen at once. So a moral failure, if you have, good Lord, it's really easy to talk about those things. There's so many examples, but you can look at politicians who get caught in a lie, get caught in an affair, get caught abusing someone. You can look at leaders in churches or businesses or whatever, where when you see people who have these major moral failings, who do something terrible, they abuse somebody, they hurt somebody, those things don't happen all at once. Okay, there's a story behind that. There's a series of small compromises that leads a person to go from one thing to becoming something completely different. From dedicated public servant to abuser, it's not a straight line. Lots of little things lead up to us. Our moral failures don't happen in a vacuum. If you cheat on your wife and she leaves you, that affair didn't just happen at random. Almost certainly it didn't just happen at random. A couple of small compromises, a few bad choices along the way lead us down that path. But if we're paying attention, we recognize there are ways to fix it. Because she goes on to say, fail in an instant, no man did. Slipping is Crashe's law. Okay, so if you go back to like physics, you might hear of Newton's laws, or, the law of XYZ. Okay, scientific laws. There's a lot of them. But those sorts of laws are based on mathematical principles and constants, things we can prove about the universe around us. Now, she says that slipping is Crashe's law. But there is no person named Crashe. I looked. Okay? So there's no law that I know of written by some guy named Crashes. I think that we're supposed to find that word Crashe and actually just see the word crash. Okay? The E is silent. So slipping is Crashe's law. Okay? If we crash, it's because we fall and fail. Now, if you know something different about this particular phrase, Crashe's law, by all means, shoot us an email or comment on social media. Let us know. Okay? But this slipping happens over time. It's not a failure in an instant. And so I think that what Emily Dickinson is trying to tell us here is that our crumbling as human beings and people, our moral failures, our integrity falling apart, is not inevitable. But that instead, because it doesn't happen all at once, we have the opportunity. Now, she doesn't say it in this poem, but any building that starts to fall apart can be repaired. And I think the same can happen to us. So Emily Dickinson's warning is good news. If crumbling is not an instant act, then there are things we can do to turn it around and prevent crumbling, because it's not merely inevitable. And even if it is, maybe we just keep going as much as we can, fighting against it, because that's a valuable thing in our own lives. Maybe we're going to fail at something at some point. But if we're paying attention, we don't crumble in an instant. So if we're paying attention, we can catch some of these things before we come apart. So, since this is a preaching poetry podcast, let's get into the take home, right? The altar call, or whatever, if you will. So my question for you now is, what are the borers? What are the cracks? Where is the rust in your life, on your soul? Is it food? Alcohol? Are those things holding you back from health? Can you stop eating bad food? Can you stop drinking? Are you addicted? Do you have some kind of problem? Can you quit? If not, crumbling may not be an instant act, but if you're addicted to something, you gotta get some help there. Right? It's not inevitable. It's not inevitable that you will come down in a crash, a spectacular crash, but if you don't do anything about it, the decay will catch up. So it could be food, drugs, alcohol, whatever it is that you're addicted to. Those things could be rust, borers in the axis, the cracks, the cuticles of dust. But it could be other things too. Like, maybe it's not your health that's in danger. Maybe you eat healthy and you use drugs, alcohol, tobacco, whatever it is, in moderation. You're careful about that. You exercise. You take good care of yourself. Awesome. That's great. But it could be something else. What else could be holding you back from a healthy relationship? Could it be anger? Could it be that you have no self-control, that you can't control your anger, your frustration? That's a hard one. Maybe it's pornography. I mean, we talked about earlier, an affair doesn't happen all at once, but if you build your life around, the use of pornography, that's going to affect your relationships with real human beings. That could be some rust on your actual soul, on your ability to have healthy relationships with a partner? Could it be that you just don't have a good work ethic, or you don't have good time management? What's holding you back at work or at school? Is it financial instability? Do you have a terrible debt-to-income ratio? You're blowing all your money on credit cards, and now you got a bunch of debt that you can't pay off. Oh, and bills are coming in. There's a lot of things that conspire to build up and crumble us over time. Let's catch them early. So, take a long, hard look at your character. Take a long, hard look at your soul. And it may be nothing that I've mentioned today, and you may not even agree with the stuff that I mentioned. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing here is to recognize that there are cracks in our souls. There is dust. There is rust. And we have got to do the hard work of seeking that stuff out and correcting it and fixing it. So take some time to check yourself for dilapidation. God only knows I've got my fair share. Okay, I'm not here trying to tell you guys that I've got it all together. That's not it at all. But we have to resolve to take action. Are you actively attempting to repair your integrity? Are you actively intending to do the routine maintenance that it takes to keep your soul humming along? It's not easy. But I also want to say this, because some of you listening to this may have already crashed. You may have already slipped. You may have already fallen. You may have already crumbled. Okay? And this is what I want to say to you. Okay? If crumbling is not an instance act, then y'all, don't expect rebuilding to be an instance act either. Don't put that kind of pressure on yourself. If you've blown up your finances, if you've blown up your health, if you've blown up your relationships, look, don't expect that you're going to fix them in an instant either. Don't expect that. Crumbling didn't happen in an instant. And success doesn't happen in an instant either. So don't give up. Don't give up at all. But I think it's important in some cases, especially for those of us who have already crashed and burned. Lord knows I've been there too. Let's read this poem backwards. And you know what? At that point, you can go back and you can listen to the builders. You can go back and listen to the other episodes that we've done, or maybe some that we're going to do, because there's no good reason for you to give up. Don't quit on this. But don't try to be the master of your fate and the captain of your soul all alone in it either. You may need to go get help. You may need to go get counseling. You may need to go get therapy. You may need to go get a bunch of other people who can help you do better. Like, I can tell you that for me, eating healthier and exercising, that doesn't happen if I'm all by myself. It helps when I've got people who know what I'm about and who are trying to do it with me and who are going to ask me about it. It helps that my wife, like, I tell her what I'm going to do, what my plan is, and she's there. She's going to watch me if it happens or if it doesn't happen. I say all this to say yes and amen to this poem, that crumbling is not an instance act. But man, neither is building a house. So if you have slipped and crashed, don't give up. Keep going. Keep doing the work. Okay? Keep doing the work and stick with it. Hold on. Keep going. I hope you guys have enjoyed this poem. Let us know what you think. Thank you for listening to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to having you back for more. If you like what you heard, please be sure to leave a review and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for more content, you can find us on Apple, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, basically anywhere you find podcasts. If you want to join our community or just want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Preaching Poetry.